Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. Uh, for me, this is a slight change because we're doing this on Teams now. We've always used a different piece of software for our webinars, but for today, we're using Teams. So I'll apologise now if it doesn't go quite as smoothly as some of my other webinars. Plus, you can see me as well. So just to make sure you're in the right place at the right time, this is a look at the new standard, the ISO 14001:2026 standard, looking at the transition timeline, the next steps. Some of you may have attended a webinar I ran towards the end of last year, which was based upon the draft international standard. Obviously now, as we'll see, the final draft standard has been published, and this presentation has been updated to reflect the changes. Very, very quickly, just a little slide explaining who we are. If you don't know who NQA are, I'm sure you do. Again, that's just a little slide. I always sort of semi-joke that I'm contractually obligated to share that, just to show a little bit about NQA and our reach across the UK. And you can see me now, but that's me. And I'm sure, looking at the attendees, I've met a fair number of you over the years. And as I say, I've now been at NQA for 18 years, working almost exclusively on energy and environmental management. So just a couple of housekeeping things, because this is slightly new. The way to ask a question, you should see at the top of the page where where maybe my photograph is or my film is, you might see a tab that says Q&A. If you want to type questions in there as we go along, feel free to do so. If a question pops up and I'm still on that particular section of the presentation, I'll try and answer it there and then. If not, we'll hold it over to the end and we'll take it at that point. And also, to save anybody asking questions, you will get a link to a recording of this webinar. So you'll hear me, you'll see me, you'll be able to see the slides in the recording. And all registered delegates will also get a copy of the slides. I think we send them out in PDF format, just so that it's a little bit easy to send them. So you will get copies of the slides, you will get a recording of the webinar itself. All being well, I think the last presentation I did on this ran to just less than an hour. We'll see how we go. I guess it depends how many questions we've got and what we need to cover. Okay, so right, let's make a start. So what are we going to look at? So we're going to look at the changes on the new 14001:2026 standard. What are the changes from the 2015 version? A little bit of information about why the changes are taking place. Why do we need to update the standard? Some key dates and the transition timeline. That's all been firmed up now. So if you sat through the last presentation, there was some we weren't quite sure of the dates and the timeline, how to prepare for the changes, and how we, as a certification body, NQA, can help you, and a little bit of a link into some transition training that we're offering, and of course the questions and answers that we'll either look at as we go along, or we'll cover towards the end. So just the note that's on the right. So the information in this webinar is now based on the current final draft international standard, what's known as the FDIS. It is strongly likely, or highly likely, that this will reflect the published version. As the way ISO works, the way the technical committees work, going forward from this point onwards, major technical changes are not allowed, are prohibited, and only minor editorial corrections are allowed. Punctuation, spelling, not that I found any spelling mistakes, but it's only minor editorial corrections. So what I'm telling you today, I am 99.9% certain is not going to change on the date of publication. Speaking of publication, this is now the confirmed timeline. So obviously the current standard, the 2015 standard, was published on the 15th of September 2015. And the following through this particular standard, the draft standard, the one that I prepared the previous webinar on, was launched in June 2025, June last year. The FDIS, the final draft standard, the one we're working on now, was published on the 5th of January, two Mondays ago today. And then the date, as I've been told, is now, assuming everything goes fine, the aim is to publish a standard on the 15th of April. 15th of April 2026, and that is when it will appear. And the transition deadline has also been confirmed as 3 years. So 3 years from the date of publication. So if an organisation hasn't made the transition to the new standard, all certifications, registrations to the 2015 standard will expire automatically on the 15th of April 2029. Now that's a long way away, and as you'll see, the changes themselves are nowhere near as onerous as the changes were in the 2015 standard, going back sort of 10 and a bit years. So let's have a look at what might have changed and why it's been changed. So ultimately, to better reflect global environmental priorities, I think, it's 10 years, as I said, 10 and a half years, I think, since this version of the standard that we're currently working on, the 2015 standard, was published. And it's only going to be the fourth version of ISO 14001. The initial standard was published in 1996, which is obviously a long, long time. That's 30 years ago. And I think environmental priorities, our awareness, the drivers for doing this have all changed, certainly in 30 years and probably in 10 years as well. So one of the reasons for updating the standard, yes, they have to be updated anyway, but certainly it's to better reflect global environmental priorities, particularly around strengthening climate action, climate resilience. And as we'll see, there were some amendments made 2 years ago in January 2024 that added a couple of sections into context and interested parties. As we'll see, those have now been formalised. It strengthens change management and supply chain oversight, so how we as businesses, how we as organisations interact with our supply chain. It expands the scope of the system, asks us to have a little bit of a deeper look at a life cycle perspective, supporting the focus that we have as an organisation beyond our own facilities and operations. And ultimately as well has been tweaked a little bit to make it more consistent and better align with what's known as Annex SL, which is the ISO harmonised structure for all management systems. So there's a couple of areas where it's been brought into line with some of the other parallel standards. I believe the view of ISO is the changes are deemed to be moderate. Obviously, I think for the 2015 standard, they were significant, but for this update, they're deemed to be moderate. And as I've said, they will enhance the following areas. So enhanced areas include climate change, climate action, and environmental resilience, supply chain sustainability and due diligence, a slightly more focused view on a life cycle perspective. That term obviously was in the current standard, the 2015 standard, but again, the use of that has been enhanced a little bit. Slightly more emphasis on a risk-based thinking throughout the whole environmental management system, and a greatly expanded Annex A. So Annex A is the bit at the end, the second part of the standard. It's not the auditable part of the standard, but it gives guidance and some further explanation and rationale as to the actual clause of the standard. That has been expanded to give some clearer guidance in terms of how businesses, our organisations might implement the standard. So the following clauses have been updated, and we're going to have a look at these changes in the coming slides. And there are some tweaks, some minor changes to some other clauses, which we might reference in passing, but we're not going to go into any great detail. The clauses as listed on the slide there are the clauses that have got some changes into them, and you will see that it highlights there the key changes. It gives an idea as to what the changes are, and that's what we'll look at in a little bit more depth as we go along. So some general changes across the whole standard to start with. So the ISO FDIS, as it's officially known at the moment, includes some editorial changes. There are some updated references, a bit of restructuring, some renumbering, and a few areas where they've sort of clarified some points. So some of it's down to wording. That's all. It doesn't really mean any new requirements. However, one of the suggestions in terms of preparing your own EMS for these changes is that you, as always, I think is best, use the terminology that the standard uses rather than your own. There's no requirement to do that, but I always think it makes sense to use the recognised terminology. So one of the changes is the use of the word result as the term used for the output of a process. So the management review, it's now the results of the management review, and indeed the intended outcome of an objective. It's a result. Outcome remains the relevant term when considering the whole EMS. All standards, whether it's environment, quality, health and safety, information security, whatever you might be looking at, have an expected outcome. And the expected outcome of this standard, 14001, remains exactly the same, which is improvement in environmental performance and making sure that all compliance obligations are met and objectives are achieved. But generally, the headline outcome for this is improvement in environmental performance. A little bit of change again with some additional terminology. So in terms of fulfilling compliant obligations now, the standard uses the term meeting. So we meet compliance obligations, not fulfill them. I think it's semantics. I think it's just changing. It probably stresses a little bit more. I think meeting is probably a slightly stronger word than fulfilling. But there you go. That's just a little change in the wording there. And in terms of documentation, this goes through the whole standard. So wherever documentation has to be provided, the standard now says it has to be available rather than maintained. So when people like myself come in, or anybody else who may have a legitimate reason for looking at the system, we will expect to see documentation be available rather than just maintained. And then throughout the standard as well, there's some increased references to using a lifecycle perspective that prevents adverse impacts being unintentionally shifted elsewhere within the life cycle. That's a phrase that's taken from the annex, but I think it quite nicely explains why we have to look at a life cycle perspective to make sure that we are still managing, influencing, or controlling, if we can, environmental impacts and making sure we don't unintentionally shift them onto somebody else or somewhere else within the life cycle, that we do keep control or influence over adverse environmental impacts. It doesn't look as though anybody's asked any questions yet. That's fine. I've either bored you to death already, or it's all fairly clear. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions as we go along, click on the box that says Q&A and type them in the panel that will appear. So we're now going to go through the clauses that I earlier indicated have got a change, and we'll start right at the beginning. So the first auditable clause of the standard is clause 4.1, which is the context of the organisation. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Somebody has said they've sent a couple of questions already, and I can't see those. I might just ask Marissa, who's actually sitting in and facilitating this, what the issue might be as to why I can't see any questions just at the moment. Okay, anyway, we'll come back to that. That might just be an administrative function at our end. As I said right at the start. Oh, here we go. I can see them now. Okay, let me just quickly, before we get into the clauses then, let me just see if anything would change. If a company chooses, this is Sarah, if a company chooses not to align to new language in the revised standard, if you want to maintain language your staff are familiar with, would you recommend that the decision being recorded in management review? I think so. It's always best to justify that it is a decision, that it's a conscious decision and not an oversight. Whether the management review is the right place to document it, probably is, to be honest. But yes, I think rather if you take a conscious decision, then I've no issue with that. When is NQA expected to publish dates on lead auditor training transition? I'll leave that one to the training team. How long will the training be? If you just hold fire, Ambreen, for that, the slide at the very end explains. It doesn't give any dates, but it will give you some. It'll give you some details as to the length of the courses. And you've jumped ahead a little bit, Ambreen. We're going to come on to the policy. So that's fine. Right. Okay. So that's the 3 questions I've asked so far. We've sorted those out, I hope. And just to remind you, any more questions, feel free to shout. Okay. So clause 4.1, context of the organisation. So in the main, it's formalising the updates that were introduced in February 2024. That's 2 years ago now, which were and these were changes that went into every standard. So it went into 9001, went into 45,001 for health and safety, went across all of the main management standards. So that was to include environmental conditions such as climate change. So one of the things, let me just drop knock that off. So yeah, it's explicitly including now these areas such as climate change, pollution, biodiversity, natural resource availability, and ecosystem health. So it mentions us in the standard itself. So when we're looking at the context of the organisation, when we're looking at where our organisation sits and what's important to us, the standard now says we have to look at these particular areas as well. We can't ignore them. We have to look and see. It may be that we don't have an issue with pollution, for example. We may be working in an office. We may have a very minimal view on pollution. It may be that we're not in a polluting industry. We're not in a polluting area. However, we do have to explicitly review these areas and come to a position on how these areas impact on our organisation. And also, it now encourages deeper integration of anything that we say we feel is important. So let's say we feel that pollution and, ecosystem health is important to us as an organisation because we're in a context that might have an impact on that. We then have to think about how we will integrate such factors into the wider business context, but also, more importantly, onwards into our aspects, impacts, risks and opportunities, and maybe coming out into objectives. So clause 4.1 has just really formalised and given some areas to think about, formalised the changes that were introduced in February 2024, which we should all be happy with. We should all already have those in our EMS, but it's just reinforcing it and, as I say, giving some actual themes that needs to be thought about. Clause 4.2, more or less done the same. So, and there's an expanded focus on stakeholder requirements. So what the standard is telling us now, and this is what was said in February 24, is that our stakeholders themselves, and stakeholders can be anybody that has a legitimate interest in us as a business. So it may be our neighbours, it may be our people within our value chain, our suppliers, our customers, it could be pressure groups, it could be shareholders, it could be the employees. All sorts of different people are likely to have requirements around the areas of climate change, pollution, biodiversity, etc., etc. So therefore, and it's been sort of strengthened with a note making that point. And therefore, one of the things we will need to do in terms of preparing for this, most of the organisations I audit will have a list of who the interested parties are. I don't think the standards specifically says you have to have a list, but nevertheless, it has to be documented in some way or other. So organisations must review and update the stakeholder list and needs. So have a think about, again, who your stakeholders are, who you integrate with as a business, as an organization, and have a think about, are they likely to have any explicit needs around environmental conditions listed on the top of that slide. And again, the standard reinforces this now, any needs and expectations become a compliance obligation if you as an organization decide to comply with them. Most people seem to think that compliance obligations only relate to legislation. The standard would say otherwise. So if a particular client has, I don't know, a requirement, maybe on a type of packaging that you have to use, then that becomes a compliance obligation. And therefore, when the as we see later on in the standard, when we look in clause 9 about evaluation of compliance, and also in our lists of records of compliance obligations, these other interested party requirements, if we've chosen to agree to them, do become compliance obligations, and we have to ensure that we are meeting those requirements. Okay, let's move on. And a slight change to scope 3, so to clause 4.3. So the scope of the organisations is still within clause 4. So the scope, this is the wording of the scope within our system. So one of the things I try and emphasise is there's two scopes that sometimes people get mixed up with. There's the scope of registration, which is the wording that appears on your certificate. So if you're with NQA or with any other certification body, on your certificate there will be a snappy sentence or two which will say this is the scope of the management system. This isn't what we're talking about. Within the EMS itself, you as an organisation have to define the scope, and that is a far expanded or greatly expanded version of the wording that's on your certificate. It talks about the boundaries of the system in particular, and the scope has been tweaked to say that you have to consider your organisation's authority and ability to exercise control and influence over the life cycle of your activities, products and services. This crops up a number of times. It'll crop up again under operational control. So it's thinking about the value chain, looking upstream and downstream in terms of what level of control or influence have we got over purchasing, our suppliers, maybe our customers, maybe how our customers use our products, how they dispose of maybe packaging if we're selling things in packaging. So we have to consider what ability we have, and that becomes a part of the scope of the system. And once the scope has been defined, so once you've identified what these areas are, what needs to be included, then they have to be, and I put it in green because it shall be, that's the phrase that the standard uses, they shall be included in the environmental management system. So that's something, we can't just rule out something because it's offsite. If you can demonstrate, or it can be demonstrated that you have control or influence over something, then it needs to be included within the wording of the scope as defined in your management system, not on the certificate. No real changes to leadership. One of my slight disappointments between the draft standard and this final draft standard is a number of the proposed changes seem to have been rolled back upon, and I'm quite disappointed. I think it's a missed opportunity, but that's my personal view, not necessarily the view of NQA, but I think there's some missed opportunities now. However, we are presented with an FDIS, that will be the standard going forward, and that's what I'm explaining to you. So leadership commitment hasn't really changed in terms of the wording of the standard. There is one change in the actual wording itself, and that's the third bullet point that you see on the screen in front of you. And it now requires top management to support all organisational roles and not just management. So if you look at the current standard, if you've got a copy in front of you, the copy of the current 14,001 2015 standard, it talks about top management supporting managerial roles. The term managerial roles has been removed, and it requires top management to support all relevant organisational roles, thereby extending the level of personal involvement of top management's responsibility and accountability. If you read some of the wording within the annex, now I fully accept that the annex is not auditable, but it does sort of set the tone and give some guidance. There is a bit more of an emphasis on ethical leadership, full accountability, and obviously developing, fostering a culture of environmental and sustainable development. And because context now includes sustainability principles, then by default, leadership needs to have a more visible role in embedding those sustainability principles into the management system and how it's managed and overseen. Right, I'm just going back because there's a couple of other questions come in, so we'll try and take a couple as we go along. So does this mean that, so Katie, does this mean if a customer puts a specific requirement regarding sustainability, then it becomes auditable during a third-party audit? Is there an expectation that any requirements that we agree to should be expanded across all operations? Okay, so in a way, yes, because if I spend most of my time auditing 14,001 or indeed ISO 50,001, if I see within your compliance register that there is a requirement from a customer, a specific requirement regarding sustainability, and you have agreed to it, and that's the point. They can't just enforce things. It's a discussion, and you have to agree to them. If it's in there, I may choose to ask how you fulfill that, because at the end of the day, any third-party audit is a sample, and I may not cover everything. However, I think as part of when we come to the transition, if I identify that you've put some additional customer requirements in, I may well choose those to just have a look at. So yes, it is likely that they will be audited during a third-party audit. Is there an expectation that any such requirements that we agree to should be expanded across all operations, or is it acceptable to still only apply these specific requirements to a particular? Yeah, of course. If it's a customer requirement, if it's a specific requirement of a customer, then the compliance obligation refers to that customer, and you wouldn't expect to do that for every client. So different customers will have different requirements. What's the thinking in the standard on making stakeholder requirements compliance obligations? Will that make non-delivery against the stakeholder expectation a major non-conformance? Probably unlikely. It would certainly be a non-conformance. What I tend to judge when I'm looking at non-conformances and whether it should be a major or a minor around compliance obligations, is there likely to be a significant environmental impact if we don't meet that compliance obligation? So in other words, if it's a legislation one, if it's around hazardous waste and it's a bit of a free for all, and we're not treating hazardous waste as the law would demand, then yes, clearly that's going to be a major non-conformance because there'll be an environmental impact. It's not a black and white answer. It would depend on what the obligation is and whether I felt that it was going to have a significant environmental impact. What's the thinking? The thinking hasn't really changed. It's more a re-emphasizing of this to say that a compliance obligation by the definition of the term is an obligation that you as an organization have to abide by. I think in previous versions of the standard, they've talked about voluntary obligations, and that was always to me a bit of a contradiction in terms. Can you have an obligation that's voluntary? The answer always was yes, because it's an obligation you've chosen to take on. So I think it's trying to make sure that any organisation has things that they have to comply with, including things that we've agreed of an environmental or sustainable nature with our clients. Does the standard include definitions for things like ecosystems, health and biodiversity? No, it doesn't. It uses those terms. That's for you to decide what's relevant to you as a business. Can I give an example of maintain? We'll come back to documentation, and will we get a copy of the slides? You may have joined late, but yes, you will get a copy of the slides. You will indeed. Okay, right. So let's move on. So I think we've sort of looked at leadership commitment. I don't think there's anything else in there. Let's move on then to clause 5.2. So this is again within the scope, within the policy. There was a question I think somebody asked a little bit earlier on about the policy. So the standard has maintained more or less the same requirements for the policy. So there were a number of mandatory commitments that policies have to make, and you all of your policies, if you've got 14,001, all of your policies will have these commitments in. Protection of the environment, including prevention of pollution, and a section which I haven't put in here, but a section also about continual improvement of the management system. There is a note, and it is only a note, so notes are optional, but they are seen as prompts. So again, it talks about sustainable resource usage, climate change mitigation, and protection of biodiversity and ecosystems. So again, as a bit of a guide, if I'm auditing yourselves against the 2026 standard, if you have identified in 4.1 under context that maybe protection of biodiversity and ecosystems is key to what you do, and it is something that has a big impact on you as a business, and you've identified that under context, I might be questioning whether or not your policy should make a commitment related to that. It's not black and white, but it's a discussion point that you will be asked by people like myself and other assessors, that if you consider it important, then why has it not been included in your policy? It's not a mandatory, but I think it strongly suggests that if you think it's important, then there should be some public commitments to it. Okay, I seem to have to just click on and off the question and answer button to see if there's any new questions coming in. There aren't any at the moment. So let's move on. So clause 6, actions to address risks and opportunities. So there's been a bit of a restructure to this particular clause, moving things around a little bit, and as we'll see shortly, a new clause. So clause 6.1 has been restructured for clarity, with most of 6.1.1, which was what was called general, now being moved into clause 6.1.4. So there's a lot of moving things about. So those of you that have manuals, management systems that follow the numbering of the standard, then, and again, there's no reason to say you have to do that, but for simplicity, a lot of people choose to do that, then you may want to, or you will want to maybe just have a look at renumbering things within your own system. Planning actions, which is currently clause 6.1.4, has been renumbered as 6.1.5. And then an interesting discussion, and I thought long and hard about this one. So when we talk about aspects, we talk about things in three particular areas. We talk about normal operations, abnormal, and emergency. Interestingly, in the current standard, emergency and abnormal are bracketed together. Now they've been removed to three completely separate areas: normal, abnormal, and emergency. And it's changed the wording for emergency from reasonably foreseeable. And I always used to say that, looking into the future, crystal balls were in short supply. So what was reasonably foreseeable, to look at potential. And I think that's a slightly more defined. You could argue, we couldn't see that, we couldn't tell that was going to happen. We'd no idea that was ever going to happen. I think it's a little bit more looking at planning when we're looking at things that might happen, what potentially can go wrong, rather than what's reasonably foreseeable. I think there's quite a bit behind that change, and I'm not quite sure, because obviously I wasn't involved in writing the standard. I'm not quite sure what the actual thinking behind that is, other than I think it firms it up a little bit. And again, within clause 6, there is this emphasis on the environmental impact across the value chain, as shown below. I think the standard itself has a couple of extra bits in it. It has transport in there and things like that, but generally those are the areas: design, procurement, production, use, and disposal. So again, it's prompting us to have a little bit more emphasis on impact across the value chain. So there is a new clause being brought in. For those of you with ISO 9001, you'll be experts in this, or you'll be well versed in this. It's a clause that's more or less been lifted directly from ISO 9001, which hasn't been in 14001 before. It was sort of implied, but it wasn't specified as a clause. It is now. So clause 6.3, the new clause covering management of change. So it asks us to have a planned, structured approach in managing change within the organisation of an environmental or sustainable nature. So when things like compliance obligations changes. So for instance, we talked about, one of the questions that was asked was about customer requirements. So let's say we have a new customer that comes along, has a new requirement that wants us to actually do something. As I say, I always think it's a good example. They want us to use more sustainable packaging, maybe returnable packaging, rather than something that's they're going to have to throw away or recycle themselves. We need to have a planned approach on how we're going to change our systems, change our methods, change our purchasing, to make sure that we are managing that change properly, and we're doing it in a planned way. It's not a haphazard thing that's just going to happen. We have to make sure we're planning that change. So it may be, if a compliance obligation changes, whether that's a legislative change or a customer requirement, these are things that are listed within the standard. They're listed within the actual annex of the standard. If we make operational adjustments, we may have a new process. We may bring in something slightly different, something that's slightly better to manage, better to monitor. So we may be making operational adjustments. It may be we're using different raw materials. The interesting one, I think, is mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures. So again, companies get taken over, companies merge, companies get bought out. Technological or process shifts, that's a little bit like operational adjustments. And the one that sort of made me smile, but it's not a smiling issue, and this is taken directly from the annex. Business disruption due to supply chain issues, labour disputes, natural disasters, regime change, political unrest, or war. You might want to call that the Trump section of the standard, if you like. I don't know, but is that the Trump clause? But yeah, that's been brought in. So we have to think about resilience planning. I think that's partly what that's about. That things might happen, things might go wrong, all sorts of things can happen, things that we maybe haven't thought about, and again, we have to think about how our business might be disrupted due to things like that. That's interesting. I've got a thing now that says new posts. How does 6.3 reflect in documentation? Would it be highlighted as would it be highlighting potential future aspects? Possibly. It may well be that if you identify something that's changed, that might result in additional changes, additional aspects. Maybe it may be that we have to think about going through this whole process of looking at a change that might affect the context of our organisation. That might lead through to risks and opportunities, and risks and opportunities might lead through into our aspects. So that may be how we have to look at that. But it's making sure that anything that might happen, that we have a methodology in place for handling any planned or indeed unplanned changes. Another question, quick question, do we have to use the word pollution explicitly in our environmental policy? No, but as I said right at the start, if you use the language that the standard uses, you're less likely to have questions asked by either customers or more likely by certification bodies. So yes, the standard says you have to have a commitment for the prevention of pollution. I have seen policies that don't use that phrase, prevention of pollution. However, if you're not using that phrase, I will then want to pick through the wording that you have used to make sure that what you're meaning is prevention of pollution. So it's always, I think, clearer if you use the wording that's in the standard. It's less likely to cause any contentious issues. We should be on a bit of a downward slope now because actually there's not a lot of changes coming up. Clause 7, support. There were, I thought, going to be some changes in there. They've been taken back out. So if you compare the two standards side by side, the actual auditable parts of the standard haven't changed at all. It's almost, I think it is identical. However, again, as a reminder, and this was in the old standard anyway, communication must empower employees to be able to contribute to continual improvement. It's not quite as formal as it is in ISO 45001 health and safety, or even in 50001 energy, where there is a formal requirement for a feedback mechanism to allow staff, employees to actually contribute to continual improvement. However, whilst it's maybe not a formal requirement with an actual system in place, there is that expectation that however we work within our businesses, however we communicate, we need to be able to allow our employees and other people as well, so visitors, anybody working on site, to contribute to the continual improvement within our system. So we move on to clause 8, operations, and again, there's not a lot of change, just a little bit of changing in terminology. So requirements for climate adaptation, supply chain disruptions, and emergency planning. So where we've identified some of the things that might happen, some of the things that might go wrong, some of the things that we do that have an impact on the environment, we have to be able to control them. So operational controls have been strengthened a little bit, linking back to clause 6, which is risks and opportunities and environmental aspects and indeed our objectives. Interestingly, one of the things that has changed is the removal of the term outsourced processes, which always caused a little bit of confusion. There was some debate about what an outsourced process actually was, and I've done webinars on that over the years. So the term outsourced processes has been changed to use the phrase externally provided processes, products, and services. So that's bringing in the value chain. To me, an outsourced process wasn't a supplier selling you some items. However, it now is. But what it talks about is to establish the level of control or influence. And if we go right the way back to the scope, we only have to take into account things that we can control or influence. So if we can't control or influence something, then we don't have to include it within our EMS. I guess in terms of products and services, if we're not happy with them and we can't control them, we can't influence them, then we go elsewhere. It's as simple as that. But it's used that terminology now. It's externally provided processes, products, and services. So again, there's some changes needed to the wording within our documentation. Throughout the whole of operational control, lifecycle perspective has been in there, and that's strengthened, I think, by that use of the term externally provided processes, products, and services. And then finally, a little bit of a tweak again, emergency situations to be identified when considering risks and opportunities, not just environmental aspects. So that's saying that all eventualities, potential situations are identified, including changed in new activities. And that comes back a little bit to the question that Ambreen asked about. How does that section on change, is it reflected in documentation? Would it be highlighting as potential future aspects? So it's saying that we have to think about things as part of our planned changes. We have to work out how we might manage, how we might have to control, how we might have to look at a potential situation, including emergency situations. So just a little bit extra on this change on externally provided processes, etc. So this is some clarification from Annex A. So again, this isn't the auditable part of the standard. This is the guidance, which is there to help interpret what the standard means. We don't audit this. However, if we get into a debate, and I've had this a number of times with clients over the years, when we get into a debate in terms of, well, I don't think it means that, well, I do think it means that, we sometimes then do go back into the annex and see if there's any guidance there that will tell us what the intention of that clause actually is. So again, this is from the term outsource has been deleted and the phrase outsourced processes has now been replaced by externally provided processes, products and services. So these are organizations, suppliers, other businesses used by the organization, things that are used by the organization but are supplied by others outside of the organization. So that is a service, that's an item, goods, raw materials. It could be transport if you use a third party haulier or something like that. So anything that's used by your organization but is supplied or provided by people outside. And that's what the second bullet point means. The phrase external provider means an external supplier organisation, including contractors that provide a product or a service. But I still make the point that it's things that you can influence or control. If you can't influence it, if you can't control it, it's not within the scope of your EMS. Internal auditing, again, no real changes at all. There is a new sort of a little bit at the start of the whole of clause 9 in the first sentence. So clause 9, which is sort of all about sort of monitoring and measuring, it is very, very clear that the whole point of clause 9 is to manage and oversee the effectiveness of the environmental management system. So everything that's in there, whether it's internal auditing, whether it's evaluation of compliance obligations, whether it's management review, it is all about ensuring that the EMS that you have in place remains fully effective. The only real change is that each internal audit, so every internal audit that you have planned now needs to have a defined objective. And there's a little bit more detail around documentation that has to be made available, not retained, if you remember, has to be made available. And there are 3 things that are specific. And as an auditor, as an assessor coming in, a third-party assessor, I would be asking for these because it says they have to be made available. Black and white. Available, I expect to see them. So the audit program itself, evidence that the audit program has been implemented, and evidence of the audit results themselves. So those are 3 things. And as part of the audit program, we would then expect to see for each audit, not just what it's going to cover, but what is the actual objective. Why are we actually going to carry out that internal audit on that particular process or that particular part of the business? What is the actual objective for that internal audit? I've got something flashed up that says there is another question. Let me just see. Is it beneficial to define the expected outcome of the EMS to audit against it and ensure effectiveness? Wouldn't do any harm. I would say yes. It's, as we say, the expected outcome is the improvement in environmental performance. And at the end of the day, when I have a closing meeting and I sit down with the great and the good of the organisation, and we sit down around the table, and I'm chairing the closing meeting, one of the judgments I make is the system itself fit for ensuring that the business, the organisation, improves its environmental performance. That's the main objective, that's the expected outcome. And as I've tried to answer a couple of questions as we've gone through, is it going to be a major non-conformance if we do this? Is it going to be a minor non-conformance if we don't do that? I still come back to how significant is that non-conformance when judged against the requirement to improve environmental performance. Not necessarily is it black and white in terms of wording of the standard. It's that judgment about, is it having an impact on your ability to improve your environmental performance? And obviously, if it's massively detrimental to that, if it's going to cause a huge issue, I think I mentioned hazardous waste earlier on, and it's taking you in the wrong direction, then yes, it'll probably be a major non-conformance. If it's maybe around wording, if it's around a documentation issue. So, for instance, we may look at some wording in a waste transfer note. If that wording is wrong, it might be wrong according to what the legislation tells us. But my judgment is it going to actually affect how the waste is to be handled? So if it's a miscoding of the waste, so if it's the wrong EWC code for a shipment of waste, that could have implications further down the chain if somebody handles it wrong. If it's an SRC code that's been wrongly allocated, that is administrative. That's not going to affect the waste in any way, shape, or form. So that's the judgment that I make when I'm deciding, giving all my secrets away now, that I decide the significance of a finding. Hi, Annalie. Can an internal audit objective be defined in the EMS manual rather than for each individual audit, assuming the objective will be the same for all? I would say that a catch-all statement isn't going to fulfill the job. I accept that arguably the aim of every internal audit is going to be the same. Is the area that we're auditing, whether it's a process or whatever it is we're looking at, is it complying with all the requirements? So yes, so that might be a statement, but there may be an internal audit that you carry out as a result of something. So, for instance, you might have had an environmental incident, you might have had a customer complaint, you might have been a complaint from somebody next to one of your plants who's complained about something. So it may be that some audits that you do might have a specific focus. And I think that's where that you would want to maybe be a little bit more specific rather than saying the aim of all our internal audits is to evaluate compliance against requirements. That's probably too broad a statement. Hope that answers that question. And before I move on, let's just see if there's a supplementary. Could you please provide a few examples of evidence of audit results? Is it an audit report or the changes? So evidence of audit results is for me is two things. So when I have if I take my own audit, so when I do a closing meeting, I'm explaining what I found. I'm explaining the good and the bad. Sometimes there's a temptation for an audit, for an assessment, to actually concentrate on the negative findings. And sometimes, and this is, to my own shame, occasionally people have said this to me in closing meetings, you'll go through all of the findings, the non-conformances and the opportunities for improvement. And then somebody will pipe up and say, and have you anything good to say about us? And I don't mean that, it is an oversight, but it's really making sure that the audit report, however you report your audits, is giving a judgment at the end of the day. Because one of the things we do at the end of our audits, I did an audit last week, and at the closing meeting and in the audit report, it says, I'm pleased to be able to recommend continued certification. That is the audit result. So really, for me, the audit result is the view of the auditor saying, yes, this complies, or these are the issues. It's almost like a little executive summary in my mind, not just saying, well, we've got this finding and that finding. That's important, but I think to me, I would want to see a little bit more maybe evidence as to the views of the auditor. Has the audit achieved what it meant to achieve? So you've got the audit program, you've got the objective of the audit. Has the audit itself met the objectives that you set out to achieve? Okay, so that's clause 9.2. And then clause 9.3, there's been a little change since the draft standard. It's not really made much of a difference. If you read through the standard itself, if you read through clause 9.3, there are no changes to the actual requirements now. Clause 9.3 has been reorganised into two sub-clauses. It was before, but it was all part of the same clause. They've literally now just stuck it into two separate clauses. So there's inputs to the management review and outputs from the management review, or results is the term that the standard now uses. And interestingly, so information requirements for the management review are now more definitive, and the word shall has been included. Now, for those of you that are familiar with management systems, shall is a very strong word. It doesn't give you any opportunity to ignore them. The old standard, or the current standard, the 2015 standard, used to say consideration of the following areas. It now says for the management review, all of the areas, and there are no new areas. All it said is that now you shall include those. So basically now the management review input bit is, for want of a better term, a set agenda, giving areas that have to be included. The whole point is to improve the structure of people's management reviews. Now, at the end of the day, again, I make the point that a management review is a process. It's not necessarily a meeting. I see people still talking about management review meetings, and a meeting may be part of it, but a management review is a process. And then, hang on, more questions coming in. We could, I guess, add a caveat, Annalie again. We could, I guess, add a caveat to cover variation, which would need to be defined individually. Absolutely, yes. So basically, if an internal audit has a specific objective, like maybe some of the examples I gave, then I think that should be stated somewhere. So clause 10, not a lot of change, just some moving around and some renumbering, but the requirements have not changed at all. Clause 10.3 has been removed and its content integrated into clause 10.1 and 10.2. There are no changes to the requirements of clause 10 on improvement. And that, my friends, is a whistle-stop tour of the standard from beginning to end. So just some a little bit towards the end now, some sort of summaries. So terminology. Updates including replacing the term fulfill with meets in terms of compliance obligations to use, legislation itself now tends to use the term meeting rather than fulfilling. A little bit now on executive engagement, because we have to think in context around natural resources, ecosystems, etc. There's a greater emphasis on executive top management engagement in those areas. And again, Annex A is providing some expanded guidance to clarify the requirements. So, at the end of the day, I would say read Annex A as well as you read the clause of the standard itself. So what do we need to do? So you could start now, because there aren't going to be any changes. Obviously, the standard itself will be published on the 15th of April. I would start now taking, it is available as the FDIS. I've got a copy. I've downloaded a copy. You can buy a copy from ISO. I think you get it through BSI. You can't. So it is available to buy. Very cleverly controlled now, because I can't. It won't let me copy it. It won't even let me. It won't let me print it to a PDF either. I can't do anything with it. It'll probably let me print it off in hard copy. That's all. So get a copy if you want a copy, although there's probably enough information in these slides. Review your EMS context. Are we now including climate and supply chain considerations? You should have done anyway. You'll have been audited against those because they've been in the standard since 2024. Make sure that our policies use the current terminology, the current language, and the standards focus on sustainability. Review our stakeholder and risk registers to make sure we're capturing any compliance obligations. Customers or stakeholders. Make sure that throughout the audit, throughout the system rather, we are looking at life cycle assessment practices. Are we looking upstream and downstream to the point that we still have control or influence? Make sure that our internal audit procedures, processes, and management review now reflect the new terminology and the new slight requirements, but make sure particularly our management review does include, not consideration of the areas now, but does include all of the things it tells us we have to include. But above all, engage your leaders early on this, because obviously this is coming. This standard will be out in 2 or 3 months' time. Obviously, our role, keep in close contact with your certification body. I hope it's NQA. We will offer information. We will offer support. Keep an eye on our website. Now we've got the final draft standard, we are now able to start with some degree of certainty, providing better information. But we will make sure that all our certified organisations maintain the certification. At the end of the day, that's what we want. We want you to succeed. So, very quickly, to summarise, a strengthened focus on a broader range of environmental conditions, as we've seen. There's some restructured and clarified requirements related to risk and opportunity processes in terms of broadening that to look at some of those areas, pollution, biodiversity, things that we identify in context. There is the new clause on planning of change, so making sure that any change that happens, either intended or unintended, we're ready to deal with it and it's done in a planned manner. Strengthen the emphasis on life cycle perspective in the aspects process and moving forward into the controls coming out of that. It's changed this terminology from outsourced processes to externally provided processes, products and services. So we need to be thinking about, have we any control, have we any influence over the people that we use to provide services or we buy products from? And I can't stress this enough, Annex A, which it calls as informative, and that's the important word, it is informative. It's been substantially extended and improved for all of the different clauses to help support interpretation. And in order to answer some questions, these are the things that we are and will be providing, and we confirm a lot of these up now. So as an organisation, obviously we do provide training. There will be an e-learning essentials course, which is a short, snappy 2 or 3 hour thing that you can do online, which will expand on what we've covered in this webinar. Yes, there will be a 1-day transition course, which will take you through in much more detail all of the things that we've talked about. And for people who might want to update their credibility, their credentials, maybe better a phrase, as a lead auditor, there will be a 2-day lead auditor course. A couple of slides just to finish. Again, just showing who we are. And obviously that little bit at the end about where you can get information from and how you can contact us. Okay, so I've gone 3 minutes over, which is about par of the course for my webinars. We've still got everybody online, I think. So one last sweep, if anybody has any questions. I don't know where that's gone. Oh, there we go. That's what's happened there. Let's go back to I wanted to go back to the front page. So yeah, let's see if anybody has any final questions. There's nothing coming through. If you want to engage with me, I'm happy to. Most of my webinars, I give out my email address. A lot of you will know it anyway. richard.walsh@nqa.com. Bob me an email. Any questions, I'll try and do my best to answer them. Can't guarantee to answer them immediately, but I'll certainly get to them within a week or two. And just as a reminder, you will all get a copy of the slides, and you will all get a link to the actual recording of this webinar. No more questions coming through. Lots of people saying thank you. So thank you all for your attendance and sitting through this. So again, keep in touch. I hope to see some or all of you maybe at some time over my visits. And have a good afternoon. And thanks for joining us.